Britain had heard royal news before. Announcements, declarations, the occasional moment of ceremony dressed in solemnity, but nothing that arrived the way this did. Standing at a lectern beneath centuries of expectation, Princess Anne delivered words that altered the monarchy's future in an instant. King Charles could no longer continue as sovereign. The abdication process, the formal mechanism by which a monarch relinquishes the throne, had already been set in motion. Prince William would become king sooner than anyone had imagined. Yet the brief tremor in Anne's composure suggested that what the nation heard was only a portion of the whole truth. Before we go further into what this means for the crown and the family behind it, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a single update. The Princess Royal had come to the engagement with an ordinary schedule. That schedule disappeared the moment she unfolded a cream-colored page and placed both hands on the lectern's edge. Her eyes moved once toward the vacant chair that had been prepared for Charles, then she spoke. His Majesty has reached a decision no sovereign wishes to reach. Abdication, the formal act of surrendering the crown, had already begun. The king had concluded that he could no longer rule with full effectiveness, and William was being readied for succession. Anne delivered those facts without decoration, because she understood the weight of decorated silence. Every word she released carried both public consequence and private cost. Then came the sentence that stopped palace aides mid-step. "I cannot rule now." No qualification followed. No softening phrase filled the space. The finality of the king's own words settled over the room, and his sister's voice fractured slightly as she completed the delivery. William had received private warning only minutes before Anne stepped forward. He neither sat nor reached for the document presented to him. His only question was whether Charles had approved each word himself. When told yes, the prince stood motionless. Everything distant about his future had collapsed into the present, and the present felt overwhelming. What Anne carried was heavier than what the nation had heard. A second page, sealed inside its envelope, lay beneath the first throughout the announcement. She never broke the seal. That document contained Charles's private reasoning, the explanation he believed the public should not yet hear. Phones rose across the room before she had stepped away. Broadcasters abandoned scheduled programming. The words "Charles' abdication" spread across the country before her footsteps had cleared the hall. A senior courtier intercepted Anne near the exit and whispered a development she had not been warned to expect. William had refused to enter the throne room, the formal chamber where sovereign authority is received, until he had spoken with his father face to face and without witnesses. Anne closed her eyes for one moment. The national transition had collided with a family rupture that threatened everything the careful announcement had been designed to protect. But before Britain could understand why a king was preparing to walk away from the crown, 3 people inside the palace had to confront what each of them stood to lose. Charles was not merely a monarch calculating a constitutional move. He was a father on the verge of handing his life's defining purpose to his son. William was not simply an heir being accelerated toward duty. He was a man being called to a destiny he had always assumed would arrive gradually. And Anne had become the one person asked to wound the 2 men she loved most. Delivering truth when silence would have been far easier to bear. Charles sat by himself with the abdication draft laid open across his desk. Abdication meant, in legal terms, the formal surrender of the throne. But to him, it felt nothing like a legal term. He had spent the larger part of his existence preparing to become king, absorbing decades of scrutiny, carrying the freight of expectation, enduring a weight that seemed to have no end. Now the line that required his signature remained untouched. He removed his glasses and pressed his fingers against his closed eyes, staring at the page as though setting pen to it would dissolve the only purpose his life had been built upon. William felt nothing resembling triumph. He had shaped himself toward kingship since he was old enough to understand what the crown required. Yet he had always believed a sufficient distance still existed between preparation and the actual moment of accession, the formal instant when an heir legally becomes monarch. Catherine watched him straighten his cuffs repeatedly in the corridor before he would agree to face his father. She recognized the gesture. It was the small physical habit that surfaced whenever fear threatened to break through his discipline. She understood that accession would not merely change his title. It would reshape their children's lives, their routines, their freedom, and every fragment of ordinary existence the family still managed to protect. Anne carried a burden of a different kind. She felt the injustice of being caught between her brother and her nephew. Yet she also understood precisely why Charles had turned to her. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally conferred upon the eldest daughter of the sovereign, had earned her standing through consistency and an unflinching willingness to deliver difficult truths without converting them into public spectacle. Still, Every sentence she had spoken at that lectern felt like a blade drawn across people she loved, and she was not at all certain either man would find it possible to forgive her. Camilla learned through a documented palace briefing that Charles had entrusted the announcement to Anne rather than to her. She said nothing initially. Then she asked only one question. Exactly when had the decision been made? The question carried more than frustration. It carried the quiet terror that conversations about her husband's future had been conducted without the person who lived closest to his suffering. William found a partial answer buried inside the first draft. Charles had begun constructing abdication language weeks before Anne ever approached a lectern. This was not impulsive. A handwritten date appeared beside the opening paragraph. The prince read the date twice, then turned toward Catherine. His expression told her something she grasped before he said a word. That date connected to one royal ceremony, one hidden failure, and one private moment Charles had never brought himself to confess. And it explained why abdication had not begun the day Anne spoke. It had begun weeks earlier. In a narrow passage no camera had reached, the monarchy did not begin to fracture on the morning Anne stepped to a lectern. The true crack appeared weeks earlier, at a ceremony designed to project precisely the opposite of fracture: confidence, continuity, and an untroubled crown. Charles entered to applause, resolved to demonstrate that the monarchy remained strong. But by the time the event concluded, a private exchange inside a narrow antechamber had shaken him deeply enough to send him to his desk, where he began writing the document Britain would later discover with alarm. Charles had been warned about the Commonwealth Unity Service. Its program was long, its demands extensive, and those closest to him had quietly questioned whether it exceeded what his current condition could support. The service, a formal gathering celebrating the bonds between Britain and its Commonwealth partners, was meant to project stability at a moment when stability was already fragile. William and Anne had already begun private conversations about reducing the king's scheduled appearances, having concluded that another difficult public moment could undermine both his confidence and public perception. But Charles heard something sharper in their concern. He became convinced that his son and sister were preparing, carefully and quietly, to move him aside. Anne sensed danger immediately after the final procession ended. Charles had entered the antechamber beside Street Thenata. George's Hall surveyed the closed doors and asked why the ceremony had not yet started. Anne went still. The procession was over. It had concluded minutes earlier. With no cameras and no aides close enough to intervene without drawing attention, she took her brother's arm gently and told him where they were. Charles looked at her. The fear that broke through in that moment was more than momentary confusion. "Then I should not have been out there," he whispered. Those words reached her harder than any public accusation could have. Charles asked whether anyone in the assembly had registered his hesitation. She could not offer comfort built on something untrue. She admitted that several people had observed the moment, though they likely had not understood what it signaled. William arrived seconds later to find his father steadying himself with both palms pressed flat against a table. He moved toward Charles. The king snapped. "Do not touch me." William halted, stung. Charles turned away, and what replaced the anger in his posture was shame. A senior physician delivered a private assessment through a documented medical briefing. The doctor stopped short of instructing Charles to step back from duty, but warned plainly that continued strain could produce further unpredictable episodes in public settings. Episodes that might trigger questions about whether the sovereign remained capable of fulfilling his constitutional responsibilities. The formal obligations bound to his role, Charles received the assessment in silence. His silence, Anne later said, alarmed her more than anger would have. That evening, Charles called for his private secretary and dictated the opening line of an abdication statement. The secretary's documented record confirmed that the king paused before instructing the secretary to record the date, the same handwritten date William would later encounter inside the file. When the prince finally learned what had taken place in that antechamber, the grief he felt curdled into anger. Not at his father for faltering, at his father for carrying the secret alone, for denying his family any chance to stand beside him while there was still time. The hidden ceremony had explained the choice, but it could not prevent what followed when the two men finally faced each other, with no prepared statements between them, no equerries nearby, and no polished language available as a shield. William entered the king's private sitting room and closed the door. The abdication papers rested on the table like an exhibit. Charles believed he had been protecting his son from a burden no man should inherit unprepared. William believed his father had denied him the chance to carry part of it earlier, when it might have made a difference. William set the dated draft on the table between them. He had arrived immediately after Anne's announcement, already wounded by the understanding that the public now knew nearly as much about the plan as he did. "You made decisions about my family's future without once speaking to me," he said. Charles kept his eyes on the page. He had told himself that the secrecy had preserved for William, Catherine, and their children a few remaining weeks of ordinary life before duty consumed everything. Eventually, Charles raised his face. He said William was treating abdication as though it were nothing more than a constitutional mechanism, the formal surrender of the throne, when what it actually meant was the loss of a purpose he had spent the entirety of his adult years working toward. William answered without hesitation. He was not looking at a constitutional mechanism. He was looking at a frightened father who had refused to trust his son. That sentence shattered whatever composure both men had brought into the room. Charles pushed his chair back with enough force to strike the cabinet behind him. Fury crossed his face, then collapsed immediately into exhaustion. He moved to another seat and said William had entered the room already believing he was prepared to replace him. The prince recoiled. His voice cracked when he said he had imagined something entirely different, his father standing beside him at the eventual moment of accession, the formal passage from heir to monarch, not surrendering the crown in grief before that day had arrived. William came closer. Charles raised one hand. Then, through the documented record of their private conversation, the king revealed that he had considered another option. A regency, the arrangement by which another royal assumes the sovereign's duties when the monarch cannot perform them fully. But legal counsel had advised that William could bear the practical weight of kingship without receiving its complete constitutional authority. Charles had refused to place his son in that position, suspended between responsibility and power, even if abdication tore at both of them. Anne entered when their voices reached the corridor. She looked first at Charles, then at William, and told them plainly that the machinery of succession, the formal process of transferring the crown, was already in motion. Broadcasters were holding. Officials were assembled. Hesitation would no longer protect the family. At this point, it would create a national emergency. Charles took the pen and signed one page. The final instrument remained unsigned. William watched his father put the pen down and understood that honesty had not ended the struggle. It had moved the decisive moment to somewhere neither of them could yet see. The family had spoken with a rawness none of them had expected. But beyond the closed door, officials were already determining whether Charles retained the authority to shape how his reign would conclude. Crowns may be worn in public, but the moments of succession are decided in far quieter rooms. While Charles and William confronted each other as father and son, constitutional advisors, private secretaries, and senior members of the household were tracing every consequence that a single signature would set in motion. One formal act could alter the sovereign, the heir, the titles of children, the rhythm of government, and the standing of every royal appointment currently made in Charles's name. But the most consequential person in the council chamber was not the one anyone in the room expected. Anne sat at the far end of the table, the unopened second page resting beside her. The council, the compact body coordinating the legal and logistical transfer of royal authority, understood that Charles's private intention now had to be formalized into constitutional action. An informal announcement was not sufficient. Government communications, public declarations, security protocols, ceremonial titles, and scheduled state appearances all had to be realigned simultaneously, because a single contradiction, or a moment of hesitation, would project division at exactly the moment the monarchy needed to appear unified and in control. William entered without speaking and took the unoccupied chair across from his aunt. A constitutional advisor pushed the final instrument toward him. The prince did not touch it. Anne watched his hand tighten against the table's edge before she said quietly, "Your father asked that you read it as his son first, and as his successor second." He opened the file. Accession, the moment the heir legally assumes the crown, could occur within a matter of days. That left virtually no interval for private grief before public obligation consumed everything. Camilla confronted the private secretary outside the chamber. She had learned that the proposed plan assigned her only a limited ceremonial function after Charles stepped down. The queen consort demanded to know who had determined her future without asking her. She argued that Charles had been reduced, by everyone around him, to a constitutional calculation, when he was also a husband in the process of losing his identity, his authority, and the purpose around which his entire adult life had been organized. The secretary answered, through a documented palace account, that the plan reflected Charles's own instructions. Camilla fell silent. Then she asked why he had placed that trust in Anne rather than in her. Anne finally broke the seal on the second page. Charles had requested an accelerated transfer, no farewell tour, no extended sequence of public appearances, no prolonged goodbye. He feared that additional engagements could produce another moment of visible confusion and transform his final days as king into something he could not recover from publicly. The request changed the atmosphere in the room. This was not strategy. This was a man attempting to protect what remained of his dignity. William reached the document's final paragraph and looked toward Anne. Charles had granted Anne, not William, not Camilla, not any advisor, the authority to halt the timetable if she judged that he was uncertain before signing the final instrument. The weight of that clause settled over her immediately. Her own brother had asked her to decide whether he still truly meant the decision that would end his reign. Before dawn, a private message arrived on Anne's phone. 6 words from Charles. "Come alone. We need to speak." She read it twice, trying to determine whether he was reaching for reassurance, forgiveness, or a way back. She had carried his decision before the country. Now she had to discover whether he still had the strength to complete it. By the time morning light reached the palace corridors, the building no longer felt like the residence of a reigning sovereign. Staff moved with lowered voices. Files were being lifted from desks. William's name was appearing on briefings he had never expected to receive this soon. The crown had not yet formally changed hands, but the institution had already begun living inside what came next. For Charles, the most cutting proof came without ceremony. A familiar red box was carried past his door. Palace staff had begun dividing the documents. Those still requiring the king's approval set aside, those destined for William following accession kept separate. The red dispatch box, the locked case through which confidential government papers traveled to the sovereign, had represented authority, trust, and the daily reality of kingship throughout his reign. Now an aide was carrying it toward another room. Charles stepped into the corridor and asked where it was going. The aide hesitated before acknowledging that the prince was being prepared for an emergency briefing. Charles said nothing in response. He returned to his bedroom and closed the door and stood with one hand on the handle, long after the corridor outside had gone quiet. Scheduled engagements were being canceled. Official communications were being rewritten. Senior representatives had been instructed to make no statements that contradicted Anne's announcement, because one inconsistent message could make the transition appear coerced, while one careless appearance in public could expose the vulnerability the family had worked intensely to contain. Camilla found Charles still near the door when she came to him. She told him he could still withdraw before the final instrument was signed. The machinery could be reversed, even if reversing it embarrassed the institution. Charles looked at her with quiet anguish and said that remaining on the throne because he feared becoming irrelevant would be a betrayal of the crown itself. She reached for him. He turned and moved toward the desk where the unsigned document waited in silence. William entered the new briefing room and found the sovereign's papers arranged before a chair he had never sat in. He refused to sit. He told the assembled officials that Charles remained the monarch until the abdication was formally complete, and that he would not conduct himself as king while his father still held the title. The documents remained in position nonetheless, the institution making clear that it had already begun orienting itself toward his arrival. Anne answered Charles's private summons and found him standing near the final instrument, the legal document that would formally conclude his reign. A sealed letter addressed to William lay beside it. She asked whether his mind had changed. He answered, through the documented record of their private exchange, that surrendering the throne no longer frightened him. What frightened him was the possibility that his son would carry the memory of accession as something extracted from a failing father, rather than given freely by one who still had clarity of purpose. Anne understood the wound without needing it explained. William could receive authority in full, but if resentment traveled with it, it could shadow everything that followed. She told her brother that no ceremony, no legal instrument, and no official statement could close that wound. One honest conversation between father and son was the only thing capable of doing it. Anne arranged a final meeting. No aide, no officials, no family members positioned between them. Before the crown could pass in law, Charles and William had to decide what would pass between them as two people who shared more than a bloodline and a dynasty. The moment that would determine everything did not take place before a council or beneath palace chandeliers. It took place in a small room with 2 chairs, a fireplace that had gone cold, and no one present to translate private pain into the language of monarchy. Charles entered carrying the final document. William entered carrying decades of expectation. For the first time since the crisis had begun, neither man occupied his institutional role. One was a father releasing something he had waited a lifetime to hold. The other was a son who was not certain he was ready to catch it. Anne pulled the door shut behind them and walked away. She had deliberately stripped the encounter of every institutional layer, because officials had succeeded in making the transfer procedurally efficient, but only honesty between these two men could make it something the family could survive intact. Abdication, the formal act by which a monarch surrenders the crown, could protect the institution from the damage that uncertainty would cause. But William understood that the institution enduring would mean nothing if what he and his father shared collapsed beneath the weight of a transition that felt to one of them like defeat. Charles extended the sealed letter. He asked William not to open it until after accession, the moment when the heir legally becomes monarch had been completed. William placed the envelope inside his jacket rather than setting it aside on the table, a quiet gesture that carried the force of a promise. Several seconds passed in silence. Then the king said what pride had prevented him from saying before. Through the documented record of their private conversation, Charles admitted that he had long envied the ease with which William protected Catherine and their children, the directness with which he made the people he loved feel secure. The king had told himself for years that allowing duty to override affection was evidence of loyalty to the crown. Now he recognized that he had made the same error once more by concealing his deterioration rather than letting his family stand with him. William listened without interrupting. But when his father described the abdication as failure, the pain that crossed the prince's face deepened visibly. William moved to where Charles sat and lowered himself beside the chair, not as a subject bowing before a sovereign, but as a son choosing not to allow shame to define his father's final act. He said he would accept the crown only on the condition that Charles stopped describing the decision as defeat. He could carry public responsibility forward. He would not build a reign upon his father's humiliation. Something in Charles released. He said the abdication was not surrender. It was his last act of service, an honest decision to place the monarchy in the hands of someone whose strength was no longer in question. William pledged that his father would not disappear from public life. After leaving the throne, Charles would remain a counselor, a presence, and above all, a father whose purpose no abdication could remove. Charles drew the final document toward him, signed it, placed the pen down, and reached for his son's hand. William held it. Neither spoke, because the silence between them no longer carried anger. It carried something far more difficult to construct and far more durable. It carried forgiveness. Outside the room, Anne received confirmation that the decision was complete. The palace prepared its statement, and no one yet knew with certainty whether the nation would answer with grief, with relief, with fear, or with something resembling hope. The signature had resolved the future inside the palace. Outside the gates, an entire country was preparing to decide what that future meant for them. The news moved with a speed royal tradition had never anticipated. Church bells, breaking news banners, pavements thick with people who had nowhere in particular to go but could not stay at home. Silent living rooms where no one reached for the remote. These became the shared texture of a national moment arriving faster than anyone had prepared for. Some in Britain mourned the conclusion of a reign that had barely settled into itself. Others received William's accession as the renewal the monarchy had been quietly needing. But one image gathered outside Buckingham Palace captured the country's divided feeling more completely than any prepared statement could. Broadcasters suspended scheduled programming and described the abdication as the most significant royal transition of the modern era. Abdication, the formal act of relinquishing the crown, had ceased to be a private palace contingency. It had become a national event. Newspaper editors rushed historic editions to print, balancing sympathy for a departing king with the enormous expectations being placed upon the one preparing to replace him. Another being accelerated toward duty before the ground beneath him felt steady. Outside the palace, an elderly man approached the railings and fixed a handwritten card among the flowers already accumulating there. "Thank you, Charles.